thanks for joining us. I'm Rana Jawad at the University of Bath, convener of the MENA Social Policy Network. It's a real pleasure, excuse me, to welcome you all. And thanks for taking time to take part in these webinars that we're very excited about and that are sort of gathering nice numbers of people around really interesting topics that help us think cross-regionally, cross-theoretically, and cross-disciplinary, perhaps, sort of in this spectrum between social policy and conflict prevention and peace studies. So thanks again to everyone asking questions. We are recording the event, so I hope that's all right with everyone. I think you will have given your consent when you registered. If you'd like to post questions to the speaker or comment on anything, you're welcome to use the chat. But the way these webinars are working is that we're giving our speakers about half an hour to present, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. And of course, with it being Zoom, hopefully we'll have time and people can stay on for a little bit longer if the conversation so requires. Turning on your camera is optional, though preferable. And yes, I would agree with that. Maybe one day we'll all meet in person, but for now, this is a good way to bring us all together and not harm the planet anymore. So that's it for the Zoom etiquette. Thank you. Okay, and yeah, I've introduced myself. Very pleased to be hosting our speaker, Professor Timo Kivimäki, from our own department here in University of Bath on politics and languages and international relations. And we can introduce Timo now. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure, a very personal pleasure for me as well to introduce Professor Kivimäki to present today. He is a member of the Politics, Languages and International Relations Department, as I said, here at Bath, and he joined the university in January 2015. Previously, he has held professorships at the University of Helsinki, University of Lapland, and at the University of Copenhagen. He has also been director of the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies in Copenhagen and the Institute of Development Studies of the University of Helsinki. He does extensive academic work on peace studies and conflict and security issues, and has also been a consultant to various governments, including the range of Scandinavian governments, but also being an expert on Indonesia and Malaysia as well. He has also consulted there and worked with several UN and EU organizations. A range of publications related to, for example, protecting the global civilian from violence and focusing on UN discourses. This is a new book that's coming out by Routledge, forthcoming, so one to look out for, and I do invite you to engage with Timo's work. Personally, Timo has been a real mentor and had a key role to play in the project that brings us together today and has helped us set up this initiative funded by the GCRF AHRC around social protection and conflict prevention. And the work that he is presenting today is a paper that has recently been published. And it's just been a real pleasure and an honor to work with him, and very thankful that he was happy to present his work today. So we'll give Timo about half an hour, and then we'll spend some time, hopefully, discussing a bit more the issues that he's raising with us. So welcome again, Timo, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Rana, for your kind introduction. I'm of course also grateful for the fact that I can see that there are people in the audience. It's always nicer to present if one knows that there's somebody who is listening. So thanks for coming. And next slide, please. So my presentation will be based on my two latest books on intervention and on the special issue of Social Sciences Journal that we edited with Rana this year. And some of the articles of that journal are already published and they are online, while some are still coming. Next slide, please. So my topic today is the effect of developmental grievances, state fragility, and external interventions on conflicts in the MENA region. In other words, I will focus on the impact of state fragility and developmental grievances on conflicts in the MENA context, where external, often military intervention is more than 5 times more common than in other parts of the world. I use very standard definitions of my main concepts. Those definitions that I use can be seen on the slide here. It is interesting to note that these concepts are often conceptually linked. For example, in a fragile discriminatory state that does not act as an instrument of well-being of all of its citizens, for example, systematically discriminates an ethnic or a religious group that cannot be said to be at peace in any positive sense of the word, unless it also tries to tackle these developmental grievances that a fragile discriminatory state creates. Also, in case of fragility-induced grievances, when they threaten the lives of groups of people, it is quite understandable that people do not have hesitations to take up arms to change the situation if it is life-threatening already as it is. So these concepts are both conceptually and causally linked, and this obviously makes the study of the causal linkages difficult. We naturally try to distinguish between causal and conceptual associations. Now, I will start by looking at the main predictors of conflict in general, globally, and I will then focus more on the MENA-related anomalies and peculiarities. Instead of looking at all conflict predictors, I will look more specifically at predictors related to state fragility, grievances, and interventions. I have realized that the conflict problem in the MENA region is often easiest to understand by using very standard models of rational intrastate conflict developed by James Fearon and David Layton. When the state is weak, people resort to subnational groups for their security. Now, obviously, this creates a situation in which different groups and their weaponry are threats to other groups. And this explains the antagonism and fear and factionalism between groups. Now, external intervention does not improve the situation, as it does not create institutions that people feel ownership of. Emil Durkheim was right in his ideas of how institutions of governance have been successful. They need to be a product of people's own history and culture. Basically, no matter how democratic and good institutions outside forces try to impose on people, they do not work well unless people feel they have full ownership of them. But instead of believing in empirical generalizations that are developed in different contexts, let us look at what we can find simply by looking at state fragility, developmental grievances, and intervention, and how they affect conflict in the world and in the MENA region. I will start from the effect of external military interventions in intrastate conflicts. Looking at global data, it's quite clear that intervention increases the number of fatalities quite often, very much everywhere in the world. And this trend, I mean, this tends to be the case, especially with US interventions. However, intervention increases the number of fatalities, especially in the MENA region, while in the world, the US intervention is associated in existing conflicts with more than 5 times higher numbers of fatalities per population. They are associated with more than 10 times higher numbers of fatalities per population in the MENA region. There seems to be a relationship both ways, as external interventions are, of course, more likely when a conflict is exceptionally intensive. But there's also equally clear evidence of the effect of external interventions on fatalities. So unilateral interventions do escalate conflicts, especially in the MENA region, where they are also much more frequent, 5 times more frequent, to be precise. Next slide, please. In this slide, in this graph, I have compiled and put together all conflicts in fragile states during the past 3 decades. And this graph shows only those cases where conflicts were not intervened by external powers. Now, here I present annual data on fatalities and look at calendar years. So if we look at the first year, it doesn't show the whole picture because obviously we must remember that conflicts do not always start on the 1st of January. And so if we think of the intensity of the first year, we could probably imagine this curve to start from about twice as high as it is shown here, as the first year fatalities have been produced on average in about 6 months rather than a full year. So it seems that conflicts start as rather intensive and continue very intensive for 3-4 years. And then war fatigue takes over conflicting parties and violence starts to de-escalate. Now, this is unless there are external interventions. Now, what happens when external powers intervene in a unilateral manner without the mandate of the United Nations Security Council? Next slide, please. Here's what. It is interesting not only to see that fatalities increase more than 7-fold after the intervention, but also that in general, it seems that great powers tend to intervene often after the original conflict has already shown signs of de-escalation. On average, if you look at the graph, on average, fatalities were declining just before the intervention and then expanding. Next slide, please. Now, here's a graph that shows what happens with UN interventions. Now, obviously, UN intervenes only once there already is a conflict. They do not have conflicts like the one in Iraq, where organized violence only started with the intervention. This way, it is natural that also in UN operations, it seems that the operation is associated with an increase of fatalities initially. Now, what makes UN statistics look much worse is the case of Rwanda, where the UN failed due to the unwillingness of great powers to act through the organization, but also because then, unlike now, the funding of UN operations was organized in an ad hoc basis, and there were no automatic funding of UN peacekeeping operations. Obviously, after 2001, such funding has existed. Now, without that case, it would seem that fatalities in UN operations start declining already after the first year. So it seems that UN does a better job than unilateral great powers. And it seems that conflicts de-escalate quicker when UN participates in the conflict if compared to conflicts where the UN is not involved. Yet UN has not had much attention, but action in the conflicts in the MENA region. It was basically kicked out from Syria by the great powers, while it has never been offered a peacekeeping role in the recent conflicts in, let's say, Yemen, Iraq, and Libya. Next slide, please. If we look at countries where unilateral and UN interventions take place, we can compare conflict fatalities and state fragility before, during, and after the operation. Now, this way we can see how great share of interventions managed to reduce fatalities and state fragility during the operation, and how many operations managed to leave the country better off after the operation. Here on the left-hand side, we have unilateral, and on the right-hand side, we have UN operations. We can see systematically that a small minority of unilateral operations managed to reduce fatalities, while a huge majority of UN operations did manage to reduce fatalities. The third row shows the share of operations that increased fatalities both during and after the operation, if compared to the number of fatalities before the operation. For the UN, only 4 of the 35 operations were unsuccessful this way. And I must say that 3 of the 4 failures of the UN were failures that were eclipsed by unilateral operations also. But anyway, so unilateral operations, majority of them increased fatalities both during the operation and then left the country worse off than before the operation. So if one looks at the discourses of the rebels and dictators whose violence international interventions try to control, it's easy to see why the UN is so much more effective than unilateral powers. It is difficult to try to enforce humanitarian law or establish some kind of rule of law in Iraq, Yemen, Syria, or Libya by means of interventions that themselves are in violation of the international law. Such interventions that are not conducted in self-defense are legal only if they are authorized by the UN Security Council, which is not the case in any of the unilateral MENA interventions. Obviously, part of the Libya intervention was authorized by the UN, but not the regime change that kind of escalated the conflict, let alone the lawlessness of external forces are supporting in current day Libya. Now, furthermore, it's easier to feel ownership of UN operations given that all MENA countries are UN members, and given that UN intervenes with the invitation of the host countries rather than intervening against host countries and disregarding host countries. So this is why unilateral interventions tend to give rise to much greater intensity of resistance, and this is why they tend to lead to escalation of organized violence rather than contributing to the protection of anybody. Next slide, please. We can see the same pattern with state fragility. UN does a better job than unilateral powers. And yet the MENA region has not managed to utilize UN peacekeeping in its conflicts, but rather it has mostly resorted to unilateral support that different conflicting parties have eagerly invited to their support. Majority of unilateral operations have supported what they consider as moral conflicting party and demonized its enemy. And this has often tilted the balance of power against the previously powerful conflicting party, which after the operation is no longer dominant in the country. In kind of autocracies, this has often meant that the state has weakened its ability to control and regulate political and economic competition, something they have done often in an unfair way, but yet they have done it. In the new situation, such competition is not regulated, and groups have needed to resort to their own ethnic and religious groups for security services, and as the state has been unable to offer either. As a result, nothing has regulated political and economic competition, and this has increased violence in politics and corruption in economy. Now, corruption has reduced state legitimacy, and this has led to the increase of organized violence. Next slide, please. If we then think of how the MENA region is different from the rest of the world, we can see we can only see that some global regularities do not explain conflict as well in the MENA region as in the world, while then other regularities are being emphasized. In general, economic grievances, except for corruption of political elite, normally do not predict very strongly the rise of violence in the MENA region. Corruption does explain violence quite strongly, but not most economic grievances. Now, this is something. This is something that Zahra Bakarat and Ali Faki found also looking at less intensive nonviolent protest. The effect on the likelihood of protest participation of economic factors was inconsistent, whereas political grievances were more clearly related to the motive to participate in the uprising. There will be further research in the project and in the special issue on that question, and it will reveal that economic matters have been crucial for the legitimacy of state, for the popular feelings of fairness of the social contract between citizens and the state. Yet, when it comes to protest and violence, it seems that political factors have more systematically and strongly predicted conflict and violence. Now, this may be because conflicts and protests are activities of a minority of people, mostly young men from certain regions and certain economic backgrounds. It may be that economic grievances, except for corruption, do not upset them as much as they upset people who are not likely to protest or use violence anyway. So this could be the reason why economic factors do not predict conflict that well. Alternatively, it may be that while economic grievances may motivate protest and violence, they may not offer opportunities for such. Now, obviously, conflict behavior requires both motives and opportunities. Now, research by Walid Merwani, Claire L. Moden, and Nasser Adine Hamoudia, sorry my pronunciation, also suggests that economic failure of the state often leads people to opt for exit strategies. Instead of rebelling, people simply ignore the state and the official economy and operate in an informal sector. Now, this may also explain why economic factors do not predict protest and violence as efficiently in the MENA as they do in the rest of the world. The main conflict predictors in the MENA region are political. They are related to corruption and the tendency of people to resort to their ethnic and religious groups rather than to the state for their security and well-being, and the tendency of political elites to cater for their own subnational groups rather than being focused on the well-being of all citizens. Next slide, please. Now, this graph shows that there may be MENA countries and periods where even politically illegitimate states have managed to remain non-violent. Yet, it shows clearly that serious problems with organized violence have emerged only in countries and times of serious political fragmentation or factionalism. More than 42% of fatalities of organized violence in the MENA region can be attributed to the variation in the subnational factionalism of the political system. So this is exceptionally strong predictor. Factionalism does predict conflict in the MENA region. Next slide, please. So a pattern of political violence in MENA starts emerging. When a moralistic intervention supports one group, the group that they see as rightful victim, and punishes another, the group that they see as perpetrators of violence, it often upsets the local balance of power. In an autocratic context, the new balance is often in favor of challengers of the state, which may then not be able to regulate political and economic competition. When external intervention reacts to terrorist threat, this has often led to the disregard of the state. Drone warfare has been fought in Yemen, Libya, Iraq, and Syria, and it has not been controlled by the host state. This disregards the sovereignty and authority of the state in its own territory and has reduced state legitimacy. All this has weakened states. The weakness of the state then offers opportunities to violent groups to benefit from the state-controlled political economy. By capturing the state power, these groups will then win over the resources of the state that the state controls. This creates a situation in which people cannot resort to security governance of the state, but instead they must develop their own group defense. Consequently, the strength of one group then becomes a source of insecurity to another group. An intra-state security dilemma emerges. In the emerging interaction between groups that defend themselves, external assistance becomes an argument that helps the mobilization against those groups or those regimes that are assisted by foreign powers. It actually legitimizes violence. The threat from outside powers underlines the emergency and further helps violent mobilization, as Talib Al-Khayr has shown in his research on terrorist mobilization or violence in Iraq. This too will be published, has been actually published recently in our special issue. Next slide, please. Now, what can we learn from all of this? First of all, conflict escalation could be controlled by assuming a more non-interventionist policy in the MENA region. This is the policy that has produced a long piece of East Asia or ASEAN countries. Now, conflicting parties, even governments, should avoid inviting foreign military intervention, as East Asian governments have done. And invitations to such interference in domestic power struggles should be considered unpatriotic, treacherous, and illegitimate. This is how East Asians feel like it, feel external invitations. Now, East Asia has become the world's most peaceful region if we look at the fatalities of fatalities of conflict per population. So clearly, non-interventionism would pay off in the MENA region as well. Secondly, external intervention in the name of humanity, human rights, and humanitarian law should only be conducted by the agent that represents humanity. That agent is the United Nations. It's not one of the great powers. It's not none of the great powers. From the point of view of the host state's humanitarian situation, external great powers should especially try to avoid military operations that could attract opponents of the great powers to participate in the conflict on the opposing side. I think Syria is the clearest example of what happens when one great power supports one conflicting party and another great power supports another conflicting party. Now, thirdly, state capacity and legitimacy should be allowed to grow, even if the path to capable and legitimate state was imperfect. The only long-term solution that allows MENA countries their independence and an exit to the external powers would be to allow states to develop their state capacity in a way that reflects the tradition, culture, history, and political preferences of the society of each country. One should not seek perfect, but locally owned solutions that MENA states would be fully controlling themselves. Yet, outside powers should control their own actions so that they would not contribute to corruption. Stricter mechanisms should be made to ensure that especially arms trade and economic interaction in the production and sale of energy resources, the two most corruptive areas in MENA economies, that those areas would not contribute to conflict-inducing corruption. So those things, I think, would be something that we could learn from the existing research also in this project. Next slide. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
That's great. Thank you so much, Timo, and less than the time required. So very interesting. Thanks for sharing these insights. Okay, so I'm sure colleagues have a lot to think about, perhaps reconfirming maybe something I'd suspected, I know, but certainly highlighting a lot of new issues. Would anybody like to ask Timo a question or post a question on the chat or make a comment? Yep, James, was that a hand up?
Yes, thank you, Timo. I found that very thought-provoking. I have, well, a quick comment and then a question. The comment is very interesting for me that listening to this coincides with having received another massive long draft article from Gary Gertz and Stefan Haggard over the methodology of precisely this kind of research. And they're proposing a thing called large-scale, large-N qualitative research, where you're combining sort of correlational studies of, in your case, our dependent variables started out as being fatalities, and our key independent variable was intervention of different kinds with lots of confounding variables. So we look at that across a large number of cases, and we combine that somehow with in-depth qualitative research within each case. So the paper, which I'm sure they will share with you, is about how far we've got in formalizing this kind of method, which mixes these two approaches in order to try and arrive at generalizations. So slightly obtusely, I'm very interested in this as a methodological. And part of their argument is that this is something that people are doing, but without there being very much clarity about how it formally works as a way of trying to come at generalizable causal explanations when we're dealing with a relatively small number of cases, particularly where the scoping is regional, as here with MENA. So that's a sort of comment. The question I've got is about fatalities. I supervised a master's dissertation this summer by Sarah Dawson, comparing weaponization of hunger in Venezuela and Syria. And she was trying to explain the phenomenon where the state uses withdrawal of food as an instrument of power. Part of the conclusion she was coming at from just a two-country case study was where you have a failure of external agencies to somehow accelerate resolution of a conflict. You get, in these two very different cases, you get protracted periods of weaponization of hunger. In Syria through the surrender or starve policies, and in Venezuela through the selective use of committees to allocate food on the basis of your political allegiance. And that raises a question for me about the use of the key indicator of fatalities. And if we broadened our indicator to look at, and we're learning to use this indicator now in COVID, at sort of excess deaths, we might find that sometimes the lack of intervention, prolonging conflict, could result in higher excess deaths, even if fatalities were higher too. And that's a very provocative way of putting my question, which is really just about indicators.
Yeah, thanks so much, James, for those questions. I'll first actually react to your comment. I think I've worked quite much with people much smarter than I am myself, and people who understand numbers better than I do, and statistical methods, and nothing has really convinced me that numbers can reveal the causal mechanisms very well. So the way I use correlative associations is really that I don't want to start explaining something as a general tendency, which numbers do not show as general. That numbers suggest are actually just very exceptional. So numbers to me are, and these correlative relationships are more like kind of controllers of my explanation. And even in the special issue, I wanted to present some numbers which constrain the qualitative research. You cannot claim that this is general and this is hegemonic if it doesn't exist in more than one case, or if it exists only exceptionally. But once you have these limitations, then qualitative explanation is what explains what really happens. So I do think that way we can kind of combine them. So that's one thing. Then related to your provocative question, I think there's a wrong assumption. The idea of intervening in order to in order to reducing the duration of conflict is empirically wrong, because intervened conflicts last longer than non-intervened conflicts. So in that sense, that's a wrong premise. What is correct is that I think excess deaths could be a better indicator because of the fact that so many other things can happen. But I'm almost certain that your cases that you mentioned, Syria and Venezuela, the main I think our culturally kind of our culture pushes us to strategies of changing somebody else's behavior instead of changing our behavior. That's one thing which I think is often problematic. The other is, which is problematic, is something that you mentioned, the idea of how much hunger and poverty kills compared to what violence manages to do. I mean, the annual fatalities of organized violence is the same as something like a couple of weeks of deaths of only children of poverty. So these poverty-related problems are much bigger problems in terms of in humanitarian terms. Now, what we do both in Syria and in Venezuela is we impose sanctions and freeze their state assets. As a result, the poverty is not going to be less; it's going to be more. And very often we have this assumption that if somebody is a victim of violence or this kind of hunger coercion, we assume that that side, whoever is a victim, cannot be a predator as well. And that's the opposite is true, because most victims are predators and most predators are victims. It's more likely that somebody is a predator if somebody is also a victim. And then if we intervene in a conflict by supporting one side against another side, we normally just increase the number of fatalities, and we do that especially if let's say Russia supports the government, which is also a victim of illegal interventions and victim of terrorist violence, and if then we support the opposition, which is definitely a victim of horrible authoritarian violence. If both sides then add killing capacity to the two sides of the conflict, is unlikely that we will get any improvement to the situation. So I do think that we should have strategies that support something rather than oppose something. So we should have strategies to improve the hunger situation rather than strategies of punishing the one who uses hunger as a weapon.
Thanks very much. That's key point. I'm sure more could be said there, but we'll move on to a question posted by Sophie. Thank you, Sophie. So it's in the chat because Sophie's in a public space. And the question to Timo is, Timo, you spoke about the impact of moralist intervention, in hyphens, creating the inevitable binaries of rightful victim / perpetrator. Is it possible to have an unmoralistic intervention that does not create these antagonisms, and what would it look like?
I think there could be a moralistic intervention that could be useful. That even moralistic. I think these questions are inherently moral questions, but I think instead of focusing on intentions, instead of focusing on what the bad side has done, we should be focused on what our action contributes to. So we should be focused on consequences rather than intentions. Here, let's say Syria, we do things in order to signal our disapproval, and the focus is on the horrible things that the Syrian government or the different Syrian terrorist organizations do. That shouldn't be our focus. Our focus should be on what consequences our action produces. And if our signaling of disapproval contributes to further increased violence, we shouldn't signal our disapproval, no matter how much we want to signal our moral commitment. So I think it is a question of, I mean, I'll give you an example. Donald Trump assumed, and there's quite much proof of it, or evidence in favor of his assumption that the government conducted a very serious chemical weapons attack on civilians. Now, what he said in his kind of explanation of why he then intervened in the conflict with the Air Force or kind of air operations, he said that this horrible government kills even beautiful babies, so it has to be stopped. Now, whether air operations that also kill people stop something else is doubtful. But in his next sentence, he said that this also affects us because refugee flows are a destabilizing thing in our countries. Now, instead of helping those beautiful babies by accepting them as refugees, which would have been something that he did himself, he was not interested. Those beautiful babies quickly became destabilizing forces. Now, so it was important to act in a way that he thought would affect somebody else's behavior, but changing his own behavior, helping directly was not one of the options. That was not interesting. Quite many times I think we should be looking at options one of the reasons why I think UN is more efficient than France or Russia or UK or US who intervene directly is that the UN tries to find activities that it could support rather than trying to find activities it should punish. And I think that kind of supporting activities is what often works better. This is also the East Asian way. They want to avoid confrontation and conflict, and instead they try to focus on things that unite. And I think our kind of cultural starting point is to try to find the problem and then fix the problem. I think we could also try to find the good things and support them. And I think that could be a better mode of intervention.
Thanks, Timo. Would anybody like to ask any other question or give some further feedback on the issues discussed?
Could I ask a question?
Of course.
Thanks very much, Timo, for the presentation. It was really fascinating and thought-provoking. I just had a question about the regional dimensions and the role of neighboring countries in intervening in conflicts in the MENA region. So I think you had focused primarily in the presentation on UN and the kind of great power interventions, but I just wondered if you'd also looked at the role of neighboring countries like Saudi Arabia or Iran and the extent to which their interventions might be influential, or would this be something that it would be possible to look at quantitatively? Yeah, so I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Thanks, Oliver. This is a kind of logical question after what I've presented, and is also kind of guiding my logic of my own research, because my next book will look at the regional kind of interventions. I mean, already now, I've been looking at mostly kind of regional organizations like AU, African Union. They are definitely often more useful than great power intervention, which to me was a bit surprising. I don't know if they would be in the Gulf region, for example. I don't think, for example, that Iran's activities in Syria are tremendous, or Iraq are tremendously helpful. I think they are also killing. I mean, they are also increasing killing capacity, and since there are other powers helping the opposition, I mean, the opponent group. Both, I mean, the increase of killing power of both sides of the conflict rarely de-escalates conflict. So I think both Saudi Arabia and Iran are doing a disservice to the people when they support militarily groups. Yeah, but that's the next project.
Thanks. Thank you very much, everyone. I'm just mindful of the time. We've got 5 minutes left, and I'm sure colleagues may have other meetings to go to. Before we wrap up, would anybody like to propose any more questions or additional thoughts? No. Okay. Well, I mean, if I may say, just to come in very briefly, I just really want to support this point from Oliver about the regional actors. I think certainly for key political actors within any country, in certainly the Arab region, there is a strong sense in which there are international Western powers, but also regional allies, and there is a movement of resources and funding and strategies. So I think as an outsider on this topic, certainly I would really emphasize that. I think I just want to perhaps end, if I may, on Timo's point about supporting initiatives and kind of, rather than punishing, thinking about areas of strengthening local ownership and local resources. And I think perhaps that's where some of the linkage and the interest in the social policy broadly defined comes from. And that's hopefully something we're wanting to explore further in this project, and perhaps colleagues here may have additional ideas, hence this focus on conflict prevention and community level grievances. It did make me think, if I may add, that there is a massive international development effort that goes on in parallel to the scene that Timo described in the MENA region. From a social policy perspective, as it were, that's kind of being squeezed into the box of social protection. And in many ways, sort of the whole ethos of giving cash to vulnerable groups or people already living in poverty reconfirms a philosophy of just the deserving poor being having access to social assistance in a lot of the countries that we're discussing. And in a sense, therefore, that parallel effort to support systems of social protection locally, from my perspective and the research that I've sort of been working on, and the arguments and the realities perhaps, or the facts that frustrate me, is that actually entrenches the existing systems of authoritarianism or corruption or social assistance that already exist in these countries. So there's a kind of very much an international order, though I would absolutely focus on local responsibilities and regional responsibilities as well, because agency works both sides. So certainly, yeah, lots of things to discuss further there. Thank you all, everyone, everyone for joining. I think we'll have to draw this to an end, and thank you again to Timo for presenting this work. Olivia, our project manager, has left the meeting, but she's posted some information in the chat about forthcoming webinars and a funding call we've just launched. So let's stay tuned. If anyone new to the group would like to present their work or likes to suggest a presenter, please do get in touch, and hopefully we can meet again. I wish you a happy sunny day from Bath in any case, and thanks to everyone. See you soon. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Timo.